Hi, so you've just got your brand new shiny Meta Quest 2, or in my case it was an Oculus Quest 2, but it's all the same. It's the same thing, you know? So the question you may have now is, can you run VRCHAT on a PC, on your PC specifically? The answer is maybe, and we're gonna find out if you can. So to find your system specs, what you want to do is you want to go down to the search bar at the bottom here. So like bottom left corner of the Windows screen. This is on Windows 10, by the way. And you want to type in there, you want to type system information. And then at the top here, that's the result we want. So that is just an application that'll show you all of your system information. So if you look in the middle of this first list here, you have the processor. That's your computer's CPU. That's what runs most of the software that's not graphical. So any program that doesn't really have a GUI is going to use the CPU almost entirely. VRCHAT, however, uses the CPU for a lot of things, but the actual graphics are the GPU. So now if you look a little lower on this list, you can actually see our current physically installed RAM. And RAM is what the application uses to hold its temporary data. So any processing data or game assets that it doesn't want to keep on a hard drive, it'll keep here. So for example, mine says 16 gigabytes. That's 16 gigabytes of RAM. So down here, that 2.38 gigabytes, that's my page file. Now, a page file is basically where the computer puts stuff that it cannot or will not fit on RAM. For example, assets that don't need to load very fast, or just excess that it cannot hold on RAM. If it couldn't hold them anywhere, the program wouldn't run. But you can run them off of storage. It's just really slow. So anytime a game tries to access those assets, it's gonna have to wait for the hard drive that it's on to actually get to them. And for a comparison here, a normal SSD is 400 megabytes per second, right? A RAM is roughly, the DDR4 in here at least, is almost 40 gigabytes per second. So that's 0.4 gigabytes per second versus 40. That's 100 times increase. So at the top left of this page here, you can actually see that there is a drop-down menu type thing. So what you want to do is actually drop that down, go to display, and then it should list your active display adapter. Now if you're on a laptop, it's probably going to list two, one for integrated graphics and one for a dedicated, or just integrated graphics. But if you're on a desktop, usually it'll list one. And in this example, that would be the GTX 970. It used to be that you could compare CPUs based on clock speed alone. So for example, a 3 GHz CPU is faster than a 2 GHz CPU. That's no longer the case, like even remotely. So the way that you should compare CPUs is benchmarks. You want to use benchmarks. The main benchmarks that I use are user benchmark, which has had some problems in the past, and I'm not sure that they ever got past them. But in my experience, the scores seem to actually line up with real world. The next one is just gaming, in-game performance numbers. So if you take two CPUs and you can compare the frame rates from one CPU to the next. The last one that I use regularly is Geekbench 5. And the reason I use Geekbench 5 is because it's well supported on everything. You can compare phones to desktops. Some other benchmarks I use for CPUs are 3D Mark CPU, which is just 3D Mark, there's a CPU benchmark, Passmark, and Cinebench R23. I don't use those as often. Look up the benchmark that you want to run and go to the site. You should be able to find a download link, but you don't even have to do that. Honestly, if you have your specs from the last step, you can just take the CPU, type that into the benchmark browser. It'll show you the averages. So I've built up a few test rigs to run VRCHAT on just to see how much CPU actually matters. And these are the scores of those from my favorite benchmarks. Up first, we have the PENTIUM G6950. Now this is a core from somewhere in the 2010s, I believe. Very old. Single core is roughly half of what it is now, a little more if you go up to the top of the list. The real problem is that it has 2 cores. When I went to play on the PENTIUM, which was the first one I tested, I ran into a problem, and that's that these older CPUs don't actually support SSE 4.2. And Oculus does a preemptive check for SSE 4.2 when you're installing the Oculus client. As far as I can tell, the game runs fine without it. In fact, all of these processors, I ran it without SSE being on. So the way to get around the SSE 4.2 check is just to run the Oculus installer in an emulation environment. And you can do that with this Intel package here. Basically, put that in the folder with your Oculus installer. There's going to be a link in the description as well. And what you want to do now is open a command prompt with elevated permissions. And then you want to CD, which is a command that just brings you to a file or folder, to the path of your wherever Oculus is. And once you're there, just type in this command, and it should run Oculus installer in the emulation environment. So this part takes a minute. For me, it took probably 5 to 7 minutes just for the Oculus launcher to come up. And that's it. You just let it install, and it's never a problem again. I don't know that SSE 4.2 is actually necessary. I think they just wanted to make things obsolete because they could. So your mileage may vary, but in my experience, it's fine. So if you notice, the sound is clipping, which is I wouldn't consider playable. Frame rate's low as well, but you can muck it through that. So I think this one definitely gets a not playable. I hate to say it. The AMD PHENOM 2 X4 960T. Now that's a weird name. I don't know why they named it that. I got it for $7 or something on eBay, just for testing purposes a while back. So if we look at the gameplay for this one, we actually, it's playable. I played Murder on this for a while, and I totally forgot I was doing a benchmark. I mean, the frame rate was low, it was at 23, basically the entire time, but it was incredibly steady. In my opinion, PHENOM 2 X4 960T, just awful as a processor, but VRCHAT's playable. So make of that what you will, but I think this one gets a pass. Okay, so all of them passed except for the PENTIUM, and I say that because the PHENOM was the second slowest, so if it just goes up from there, the frame rate's just going to go up. For example, the XEON had 30 FPS pretty much constantly, and then the 5600X had 60 to 70 FPS, and both those are playable. So all but the PENTIUM passed. Okay, let's talk GPUs. So this is by far the most important part of any gaming rig. So what benchmark applications should you use to benchmark GPUs? User benchmark? I'm putting that one at like a mid-level. 3D Mark is one that I use quite a bit. More recently I've started using GFX Bench, because GFX Bench is cross-architecture. So it looks like the benchmark scores line up pretty well to in-game performance, 970, 480, and 580 being pretty close in frame rate. The 1080 Ti is about how much higher it should be in-game. If you want to play full resolution, which is 5408 by 2736 or something close to that, if you want to play that, you're gonna need a card with more than 4 gigs of VRAM, because this'll happen if you only have 4 gigs of VRAM, and then it'll probably crash. But of the two cards here that can do the full resolution, the RX 580 gets about 28, I think is what it said. The 1080 Ti gets closer, I think, to 60. And I actually looked, and it's not being CPU limited. If we look at the two 4GB cards and run them at low resolution, they actually run pretty well, getting around 50-ish FPS average, and the hitching is somewhat of a problem, but after a few minutes of being in-game, it seems like it clears up. Let's talk RAM. So how much RAM you need is actually dependent on what video card you have. I think mine was sitting at about 10 gigabytes while I was playing the game with the 1080 Ti. If you had a 480, a 4GB or a 970 4GB, you're going to want more RAM, because the assets that the game can't put on VRAM, it seems like it shoves them into RAM. So when I was using my 480, 4GB, the VRAM seemed to be not really an issue, but my normal RAM was sitting at 14 gigabytes, almost 15 gigabytes. So I'd say if you're using a 4GB card, you're gonna want 16 gigabytes. That seems like it would be good. But if you're using a higher memory card, like for example, an 8GB or an 11GB, you're fine with 12. You're fine with 10 gigabytes if you want that weird number. With the 1080, even 8 gigabytes was fine. VRAM is all-powerful, it seems. So finally, the reason I've been talking about cross-architecture in the video is because the Quest itself can play VRCHAT. And it plays it decently, with the average frame rate being around 30, and then in more complicated things like Murder 4, the frame rate goes down to 18, which is low, but it's steady and it's low latency, so it's not the worst. Quest actually has decent performance, despite its slightly lackluster specs. But the reason I wouldn't play on it, personally, is because none of the avatars and a bunch of the worlds don't work on it. There's just a lot of this game that you'd be missing out on if you were playing on a Quest. I don't know that I would play this game quite so much if I didn't have the cool avatars and stuff. I mean, that's just kind of a big part of it for me. Your views may differ. That's about it. I hope you enjoyed the video. This one took a while to make, but I did enjoy making it, and I hope you enjoy watching it. And I'll make more if you guys want. See ya.